I would kind of step back and say, like, why we should have more kinds of places where people are working on technology that doesn't immediately make sense as an investment, and actually then design those institutions so that they are like kind of like maximize the impact and the amount of that the technology that they create that gets out into the world, instead of just trying to improve the existing university tech transfer offices.
Ben Reinhart from Speculative Technologies. Thanks for joining me today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Ben, let's just kick off. Start by telling me a little bit about your background and a little bit about Speculative Technologies, what it is, why you founded it, and what your mission is.
Totally. I can combine those two into a nice story. So my career path, I like to describe as kind of being like constantly disappointed with organizations that I thought were supposed to enable more amazing technology to get out into the world. So I did my PhD in space robotics. I was a little bit frustrated with academia and government research. Went out to Silicon Valley, worked at a startup that raised a lot of money, thought I could do it better, quit, started a startup, worked at a VC firm, realized all of the constraints there. Briefly worked in Singapore, helping people start startups there. And sort of the culmination of all of this was the realization that that we didn't have institutions that were enabling the kind of work that I really wanted to see happen in the world. So this sort of like very ambitious systems building for new technologies. And so I started Speculative Technologies to try to be that kind of institution. So I like to describe us as a nonprofit industrial research lab. So nonprofit because I think that a lot of this, what I call pre-commercial technology research, does end up being public goods, and there's it would be great to capture the value, but I think that trying to capture enough value to make it be a good investment is at odds with actually developing a lot of the technologies. And then industrial research lab, because nevertheless we're still really focused on building useful, applicable things that get out into the world.
So you're really focused on physical technologies, and I'm hoping that you can talk a little bit more about that. That's one of the things that sets Speculative Technologies apart from similarly placed organizations. So why are you focused on physical and material technologies?
Yeah, so I mean, we are physical material beings, and the things that sort of improve everybody's lives, right? Like, are physical material things. And then we have this broader thesis that materials and manufacturing technologies underpin civilization, right? So, in order to have basically anything, you need materials, which are like stuff, and then manufacturing, which is a way to turn those things into stuff. And so, and sort of everything else is downstream of that, right? Like everything from, if you want better health, you need things like stainless steel that you can use to make antibiotics and surgical implements. If you want better compute, at the end of the day, that compute needs to happen on physical substrates, and so you need better materials to build transistors out of. And then also, I think that the material technologies are the things that are like physical technologies run into many more frictions than software, right? Like I guess I'm a pretty big believer in sort of the like 140 characters, like where's my flying car thesis, that we like sort of institutionally we're pretty good at developing software. Like you look around the world and AI is doing pretty well. There's a flourishing ecosystem of AI companies and doing things in the software world. I think the same is not as true for physical technologies.
So tell me a little bit about how you're organized, how you pick the projects that you're funding. With organizations that are investing in software, you can make relatively small bets, and then some of them will pan out, many of them won't. It's just a higher dollar figure. There's a higher barrier to entry if you're working in the physical world. So what's your business model? How does that actually work out in terms of those investments and how you nurture them?
Gosh, so I will tell you I'll tell you the reality, and then I can tell you about the sort of ideal thing, right? So the reality is that we filter on a couple of things, right? So first we ask is there a person who can lead this program, right? So we sort of organize ourselves around programs, which is a very fuzzy term for just like the unit, like what is a thing to make the technology, right? So and our thesis is that you really need a opinionated leader who's pushing that forward. So we ask, is there someone who can run this? And the skill set that you need to run that, and the sort of like ambition that you need to run that, cuts that down to a fairly small number of things. And then there's a question of like, would this happen otherwise, right? So if something makes sense as a startup, we should not be doing it. There are many startup accelerators out there. There's tons of VC money. Like, we shouldn't be doing it. And so there's kind of this like, would this happen without us? And if it will, then we won't do it. So like those two filters. And then the third and kind of biggest one is like, can we get funding to do it? Right. So we, like, much to my chagrin, are not sitting on a giant pile of money that we can just deploy however we want. We then need to sell programs to funders. And so that is, if anything, like the biggest test. And so between those three, that sort of like naturally limits us to like that if anything, over constrains what we work on. Sorry. The last thing is just like, is it in materials and manufacturing? Because that's sort of the scope of the sorts of things that we work on.
So yours is really the first kind of nonprofit entity like this. A lot of similar labs have been set up, funded by the Department of Defense, by Department of Energy, other federal government entities. And the traditional way that we have thought about that was 6.1 research being basic research, then 6.2 being applied research. It goes and becomes a little bit less of a public good, a little bit more commercializable. You've argued that this method of thinking about investing in funding science and technology research is antiquated. Part of what you're doing is trying to show why that's wrong. So what's wrong with the traditional way that we think about public funding of science and technology research?
Oh gosh, there's where to start. I think the first, maybe the place that I would start is noting kind of what I see as a fundamental tension around government funded or publicly funded research more generally, which is, on the one hand, as you know, citizens in a democracy, we want the government to be responsible with our taxpayer dollars, and then on the other hand, in order to do great research, a lot of it is not justifiable a priori. Like you don't necessarily know that it's going to work out, that it is a quote unquote good use of money. And even beyond that, sometimes you need to do things that are like explicitly irresponsible, right? Where like the expected value calculation of doing the work is negative. And yet you do it anyway. And so that creates this tension that leads to everything from like extremely heavy grant applications and basic and sort of like very risk averse research funding to every, you know, like on a pretty regular basis, every decade or two, the government comes in and is like, why are we spending money on all this stupid stuff? And then cuts it. And if anything, like research really does need that stability. So there's that fundamental tension in sort of the system. And then add to that, the sort of the expectation that we've built in that all this research is being done primarily by universities and other academic institutions, which have sort of organized themselves around the very admirable ostensible goal of like finding the truth of the universe and like novel ideas and publishing papers, which is very good for science. But then for technology, you don't really care if it's novel, you care if it works. And so then we've also coupled a lot of the science, the thoughts about science funding, public science funding, and technology funding with sort of a lot of alternative goals that you need to sort of like lump in to make it politically tenable, right? So, we think of it very explicit, like what's going to like do economic, what is going to create economic change, especially in different regions. How do we train the technical workforce of the future, right? Like all of these things get lumped in. There are many grants that are like very explicitly, you can only spend this money on grad students. And I like to analogize that to saying like some mandate that a company can only use interns to develop the new products, and like that's ridiculous. So those are a few ways that we've organized it, and then maybe the last is like a little bit philosophical, but we've encoded into law this idea that you go from like basic science to applied science to development, and if you look at how technology actually happens, it never follows that nice linear pathway where you have someone, say, trying to create a transistor, like trying to create a useful thing, realizing that they don't understand enough about how electrons move to make that thing, and then needing to go back and do some like what would be called basic science, but really like understanding the universe in service of this very applied thing. And that coupling is incredibly important. So when you sort of like try to like dice that up and have this expectation that people are just going to like sort of like throw it over the wall to the next part of the pipeline, then it makes the whole system extremely inefficient.
So is it really just a question of having over-bureaucratized the process of science, a lot of risk aversion that's driven by politics, and then adding on a bunch of goals that are not related to just producing as much scientific and technological research as possible? Is that something where we can cut through? Can we cut through all of this and recapture the magic of ARPA of the late 60s and early 70s?
I don't think so. One is I'm very opposed to I don't think you can rewind time, so you can't just like go back to the good old days, right? Like because this is all coupled to a sort of like science and technology ecosystem that is like massively larger than it was in the 60s. I think that I don't think that we can go backwards in terms of the amount of oversight that the government wants to put on things, and then also I think that so we need to sort of say like, okay, based on the world that we have today, what is the system that we can build for the 21st century, instead of just saying like, oh, let's just like undo everything that we did and go back to the 1950s.
And that's some of what ARIA has been trying to do in the UK. Are there similar efforts underway in the United States or in Europe?
I mean, I would say the most in Europe there have been rumblings about it. There's this organization called SPRIN-D in Germany that has been doing similar things. There have been rumblings about a Japanese ARPA that I think is sort of going through the political process. In the U.S., I think it on the government side, ARPA-H was stood up recently to try to do the ARPA thing here. And then I think in the U.S., what I would really point to is a number of sort of like, I call them like weird non-traditional research organizations that are springing up to try new ways of doing things. Right? There's us, there's Convergent Research. There's this organization called Blueprint Biosecurity that's focused on biosecurity. I think that's really where the efforts, a lot of the efforts that I'm excited about in the U.S. are sort of coming from the private sector, and not directly from the government.
One of the favorite questions that philanthropists and leaders in kind of the free market economics world like to ask is, why is there no Milton Friedman today? My question for you is, why is there no Vannevar Bush today?
Oh gosh. I think that to some extent the government has become allergic to people like Vannevar Bush, right? Like that's one thing is that anybody, or maybe it's to put it differently, anybody with the clout of Vannevar Bush is not does not have unique and interesting ideas and the willpower to try to make them happen. Right? Like Vannevar Bush was this extraordinary combination of like one like practitioner, right? Like he started Raytheon basically. And so he was a professor, he was an entrepreneur, he ran research like all of US research during World War II. And so he both had and he had like extremely precise ideas. Like you read his writing and it wasn't kind of like generic platitudes. It was like, okay, like here are some very specific ideas about things that need to happen in the world. So you both
And
like,
to go back to your earlier point, he had the ambition to actually instantiate those things in the world.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I think it really is this thing where people who are politically palatable don't have those are like there's a filtering function where there's like the people with the ambition and the ideas, and then there are the people who have the political power, and they've sort of become sort of bifurcated.
When policymakers like to talk about, we need more innovation in America, we need more investments in basic science and research, the answer to this is almost always some kind of subsidies, some kind of spending, setting up some kind of new program. What would a good pro-innovation policy look like in America, setting aside the question of what do we spend more money on? Like, what are the regulatory barriers? What are the cultural barriers? What is what drives the risk aversion in the national labs and science funding agencies? What would policymakers really do to address the innovation deficit?
Oh gosh. Okay. I need to compress it. So the one reason that I'm incredibly bad at politics is because most of my policy recommendations boil down to let people do stuff, which I realize is not a thing, like not something that you can legislate. But I think it really is. I do really see it as kind of a death by a thousand cuts. So I keep a thread on X, formerly Twitter, of this, where it really is just like everything from if you want to build if you want to set up a lab that does anything interesting with chemicals or materials, you often are zoned out of it, or landlords just don't want to deal with it, and they could get better returns by leasing it as office space, right? So like there are just frictions on the like where do you physically do stuff. There are frictions on like where even just like what sort of things you can get grant funding for. So it's just like, right, like there are many even just like government grants that are specifically like this can only be for this specific technology or this specific kind of organization, right? Like it must be a university, you must spend it on grad students. So just like even just letting researchers do things with the money they have would drastically reduce frictions. I think I have this is a broader theory that a lot of the restrictions on what technology you can even sell actually like has sort of back propagates into what technology people build. I'm kind of obsessed with the fact that in the like late 19th century, early 20th century, if you were building a new kind of car, you could like build one of them in your garage and sell it to someone, and that person could go and like drive it down the street, and then you could like take that money and then build another car, and you do that a few times, and then you have enough money to like hire someone to start building twice as many cars, right? And that then makes it so that you don't need to raise venture capital, you don't need to do all like this all of this stuff in order to just get the thing out the door. And like the overhead to getting new technology out makes it so that you need a lot more money before you actually even start selling anything, which means that you basically can only get, like, you either need to accumulate a huge number of grants, or you need to go to venture capitalists who then need to have a huge return in order to make their money back, which means that you need to be shooting for the moon. I realize this is a sort of a rambly compilation of things. I think the last big policy piece is, so in addition to just reducing frictions across the board, I think that the most of the funding that is done on a project by project basis, which one introduces a huge amount of friction because you need to justify every single project that you do and every dollar that you spend on those projects. Again, going back to the fundamental tension with government funding. But then if you look at organizations that really successfully did create technology, you look at like the Xerox PARCs and the Bell Labs and all of these, the way that they operated was to just have a budget and then let them have their own internal portfolio that they allocate as they see fit, and then that sort of lets it so you can have that one guy who is awesome and just needs 10 years to cook in the corner, and then comes up with the awesome thing. And so I'm a really big proponent of I guess the technical term is institutional block grants, where you say, okay, organization, here's a chunk of money, go produce great things. Now, how to make that politically tractable with this need to justify everything, I don't know, but that would be definitely something that I would advocate for.
So I'm glad you brought up Xerox PARC and Bell Labs, because I wanted to talk about them. And then I also wanted to talk about that within the larger context of places where we've seen real significant hubs and hives of innovation. So you can think about it at kind of the city level, like Manchester in the 1840s, 1850s. You can think about it Silicon Valley, early 1960s through present, specific institutions like Bell Labs, Xerox PARC. How much has technology disintermediated the need for these kinds of centralized, whether it's an emergent order like Silicon Valley, or whether it is a top-down designed order like Bell Labs in the New Jersey suburbs? Is there still a lot of alpha to be had from co-locating businesses and people and creatives, or is that something that technology has disintermediated?
I think that there's still a huge amount of alpha. I think that there's the things that you don't really talk. It is hard to do shop talk on Zoom. When you get on Zoom, it's okay, we have an agenda, let's talk about the things. But just sort of the way that you transmit a lot of tacit technical knowledge is really just by hanging out and complaining. And it's you get some engineers together and they're I am trying to do this thing and I hadn't done it, and some guys I know a guy who's done this thing. So not only is there alpha for does the co-location lead to a lot of just knowledge transfer, it also just leads to really tight feedback loops, right? One of the things that you look at somewhere like Shenzhen today, and one of the things that makes it tick is the fact that you can just walk down the street and it's okay, there's the shop where you can get your thing machined, there's the shop that'll make the PCB for you, there's the shop that'll do that. And so just that really tight feedback loop, and you can be doing something and then go to the guy who knows how to do the thing, without needing to be let's schedule a call for next week. I think that there's really a lot of alpha that to co-location.
Yeah, it's interesting. You read a lot of the memoirs of Silicon Valley in the 1960s, and you realize how much stuff was just happening because people were getting beers after work. Xerox PARC was people just wandering around talking randomly about technological challenges all day.
Yeah.
It feels like some of that has been recreated either on specific platforms or in the cozy web. So are there opportunities to do that now and bring in people and bring in technology, bring in talent that we wouldn't have identified, that we wouldn't have moved to New Jersey in the 1950s?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like I think that the internet, like, don't get me wrong, like the internet has done incredible things for access, right? For people to get involved in communities and and learn things. Right? So there, it's like there's like all of these like, machining discords, and people can go in, but I think it really is a sort of somehow like kind of like a top of funnel discovery onboarding thing. The really it is very hard to do engineering, especially non-software engineering, via text, right? Like there are so many times when you want to be like, hey, look at this, like, this is weird, look at how this does this thing, right? Like I did my undergrad in mechanical engineering, and we would literally have conversations where it'd be like, hey, the thing thinged the thing, and then it thinged. And people would be like, oh, because you'd be like pointing at something and like making hand motions, and trying to describe that, like verbally or textually is there's a lot more friction to that. And so I think especially, and yeah, like my favorite example of this, of like how important or how hard it is to transmit some of this tacit knowledge that goes into this physical work, is this story about these two groups that were both trying to measure the same property of sapphire, and they both, like, they're collaborating, they're sending each other their procedures, and one could do it, one couldn't, until the first group literally went to the second group and we're like, okay, now do it in front of us and we'll watch you. And they went through the whole thing, and it turns out that there's one step where you had to take an oiled string, and the first group had been like oiling it with like machine oil or something, and the second group, the lab technician takes it and rubs it the string across his nose to oil it with his like human nose hair, and somehow the properties of human nose hair were such that is what made the experiment work. And I think that like science and technology is actually full of things like this, where there's like these like one little tricks that really matter, and you don't even know to ask about them until you're in the same place.
That's fascinating. What is something that people commonly believe about innovation that you think is totally wrong?
Gosh, well, a common one right now is the idea that technologies, like the sort of like natural order of things, is for technologies to come out of universities. I think that's a big one. That's maybe my spiciest take, where in reality, until the 1980s, people did not think, like, the sort of like role of the university was not to sort of create technologies and then spin them out, but instead, one sec. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, sweet. Instead, they were sort of seen as this like repository of knowledge where there's a lot of skilled practitioners, and someone who had invented a technology could go to them and say like, hey, how do I make this better? But there wasn't this kind of like idea that like universities create technologies and then people spin them out into startups. And I think that universities are actually not a great place for developing technology because of the sort of the incentive systems around like publishing papers and graduating grad students, and then also just sort of like what the labor force is, and also just the sheer number of roles that universities have taken on. So maybe that might be my and then there's like a whole tale of things, right? Like that technology is sort of like this linear pipeline. I think that, or that like science comes before engineering. All of that is bogus.
One of President Reagan's and the Reagan administration's priorities here was the development of technology transfer from federally funded research and development and from universities into the commercial sector. And that seems to have had a positive effect, at least at first, but you've been critical of technology transfer offices at this point. Why are technology transfer offices no longer working as intended? Is there something that can be done to make universities more effective at getting ideas out the door into commercialization?
So it's like I almost like, if I can reject the question in the sense that it's like, so yes, I think that there are things that could be done. Like to answer the question directly, I'm a big fan of what the University of Waterloo does, which is they just let people who they let inventors own their patents, right? So in, I think almost all, there may be exceptions in the US, the university, anything that anybody at the university who works for the university invents using university resources, the university owns that. And then if they want to go start a company, they have to negotiate with the university in order to get rights to license that technology. Like what I would just say, if you invent something here, you own the rights. And right, because I mean, from the university's standpoint, sure, they would certainly like to capture some of that value. But the fact of the matter is that the tech transfer offices in almost all universities are not profitable enough, if at all, to sort of like have the incentive to be as friction free as possible. And so you have all these adverse incentives where the tech transfer people like want to be adding value, but they're like, they can't just, it's very hard to say like, I'm adding value by just getting out of the way, right? Like this is a very common thing across the board. So
I'm adding value by just letting people do things.
Yeah, exactly. Like nobody, right? It's sort of like the doctor thing where like no doctor is like, I'm like saving lives by doing nothing, right? Even if sometimes like the best thing to do is not intervene. So I think like that is, that would be the way that I would try to make sort of tech transfer better. But again, I would push back on the whole idea that universities are the place that the technology should be coming from in the first place. There's a great book about how this sort of cultural shift happened called Creating the Market University. But I would really say like why are the universities creating this technology in the first place? And you would point to the fact that universities are basically the only place, like universities and what I call like more broadly like academic organizations, right? So I would lump the vast majority of the activities of national labs in with this. Like why are they like the places where technology is being created in the first place? And you say like, oh, this is the only place where people can work on technology without needing to like immediately justify it as an investment. And so I would kind of step back and say like why we should have more kinds of places where people are working on technology that doesn't immediately make sense as an investment. And actually then design those institutions so that they are like kind of like maximize the impact and the amount of the technology that they create that gets out into the world, instead of just trying to improve the existing university tech transfer offices.
Has the rise of venture capital, especially over the last decade or so, on net been good or bad for true innovation? And the reason that I ask is because one of the critiques of VC is that a lot of what is sold as innovation is actually just, kind of mimetic, and that we're not getting as much real innovation from VC-funded projects as we could.
Gosh. That is like, so my if you pointed a gun at my head, I would probably say yes, but I have not thought through that answer enough to believe it. That is a weakly held opinion. And I think it depends on the domain. Like, so let me push back and say, I think that VC has created true innovation in biotechnology and software. I think that the venture capital as a funding source is very well suited for biotech and software, because of the sort of like properties of those technologies and the industries that they feed into. I think in other domains it has not, in part because of sort of like cultural expectations, right? Like when people we've sort of like had a hollowing out of business models around technology besides, yes, I need to get a bunch of venture capital to make this thing real, which then makes it so that you need to like shoot the moon or go home. And if you look at sort of technology companies from previous eras, they take decades to hit their strides, right? And they're not super high margin businesses, both of which are sort of at odds with the venture capital model. Now, that being said, I don't know what the counterfactual is. Like, I think that we can't just say like, I don't know what would have existed in the place of venture capital funding, but I'd certainly like to figure it out.
So are there things that can be done to make the VC model work better in areas outside of software and biotech? Are there tweaks at the margin? Are there different ways that VCs can look at these questions?
Yeah, there are certainly tweaks at the margin. I think that they, one obvious tweak is sort of increasing timescales and decreasing return expectations. But that requires the VCs have limited partners who are their bosses, right? And so I think it requires sort of a resetting of expectations kind of across the board. I think that's one. I think that maybe the other tweaks at the margin is, and this is a thing that I need to think a lot more about, is like thinking about sort of this idea of capital stacks, of saying thinking about like venture capital money is like very kind of like expensive money in the sense that you're giving away like large chunks of a company, and sort of thinking about like what are other sources of funding for other pieces of what new technology companies need to do that you could get that are cheaper. So like thinking about like venture capital as like a piece of a bigger puzzle and working with sort of like other sources of funding to make the whole thing happen, might be another tweak.
What's the advice that you give to promising young scientists and engineers today when they're figuring out, after they finish their graduate work, should they go into academia? Should they go into industry? Should they go start their own independent lab? Should they work for an FFRDC or a national lab? What's the way that you think about helping them make the right decision for what their investments in and or what their intellectual investments are in and where their careers are going?
Yeah, I mean, first I ask them a whole lot of questions. Right? Like it really depends. Like, I mean, there are questions of like what do you want to spend your time doing? Right? Like, do you want to spend like most of your time just like in a lab, heads down, building stuff? Do you want to be managing a group? All of that, right? So like that, it's almost like a tree, right? And then, right, it's like how much bureaucracy can you tolerate? Like what is the thing that you actually want to see in the world, right? Like, and like what motivates you, right? So it's like if someone like really desperately wants to like get the specific technology out into the world, I would give them very like depending on the technology, it'd be like, oh, like that does make sense as a startup, or like, oh, you should go try to start or join a focused research organization. Versus someone who just like wants to like put their head down and work on cool stuff. And then there's like how much, like what is your risk tolerance? Like how much uncertainty can you handle, right? Like going into startups has a lot of potential upside, but also just you're often changing jobs every couple of years, and you have a lot more uncertainty than if you go and you work at a national lab, which is like, very, very stable. So I think like that's it. Like maybe the advice I would say is like, be really precise about what you actually at least think you want to do in the next 5 years. You don't have to decide for the rest of your life, and then find sort of the pathway that fits best there. And then, I mean, and then maybe like overall it's just like regardless of what you're doing, like learn to do some things that are a little bit uncomfortable for people who have primarily been technical, which is like learn to write well, learn to like I call it just hustling, like reach out to people who like it's not necessarily selling, but like reach out to people and get them excited about your ideas, and like that's going to be useful anywhere. So maybe all those things.
For people who are interested in the general question of innovation, how we get more of it, how America maintains its lead as a world innovator, what book or article would you recommend as a primer?
As a primer, I mean, so the thing that I recommend to almost everybody is this book called Cycles of Invention and Discovery. And it is by a gentleman who he was at Bell Labs and started Harvard's engineering school. And it kind of, I think, does the best job of describing how innovation actually works. And it is, I would maybe start there. I mean, I'm certainly biased towards a lot of my own work, but I think that's those are two good starting places.
Awesome. Well, that's where we're going to have to leave things. So Ben Reinhart with Speculative Technologies, thanks so much for joining us.
Dan Rothschild, thank you for having me.